But moving on from that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Maggie Mellon, who is formerly Vice Chair. Yay! Yay! Vice Chair of the British Association of Social Workers, and she is the former Director of Services for Children First. So I'd like to give her a warm welcome to Maggie.
Audience you are. Thank you very much for asking. I'd like to thank ForWomen.Scotland for asking me to speak tonight. I'm really privileged to be here. I think it's a great panel, and I think what a fantastic audience, and it's so good of people to have turned out and to be able to have this conversation tonight. So first of all, I have to say I'm aware that there are many women who have done more than I have in this area and who know far more than I do, and I'm sitting amongst them. And I hope that we'll be able to, and I know there's lots of them here in the meeting tonight, I hope we'll be able to hear from all of you tonight. I'm thinking, I mean, this is not to pick out people, but there's ForWomen.Scotland, obviously, and all the women that have done work. Murray Blackburn Mackenzie Consultancy. They work on auditing local authorities and other things, and organised a letter to the Times. Susan Sinclair of Scottish Women. Yesterday, the release of the great work that women and girls in Scotland have done with their a great piece of work, which I'll talk about again. So, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a psychologist or a teacher or a scientist, and I've steered well away from law because why would you try and get into that? And I've steered well away actually from the impact or the issues about women in particular tonight. I'm a social worker who's worked with families and with women and children and young people for many years. And I do speak up and against policies and practices that I disagree with, particularly when they actively hurt people and damage trust between citizens and government. And I've spoken out about policies that have been adopted in relation to children and young people. I was actively opposed to the named person law, which is now being struck down by the Supreme Court. But I'm going to say a few words about that, because some of you might be going, I bet you were wrong about that. But many people thought I was wrong in speaking out about that. And after all, they kept saying the intention's great, the government and its forces, it's all benevolent, it's going to do a really good thing, but it's going to be good for children, and all the political parties agreed, so we know what's your problem. The problem was that it was introduced unprecedented levels of intrusion into families' lives and unprecedented breaches of families' confidentiality. And that is still going on, by the way, even though it's breached the law. So hold the thought that the powers, but the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, and it is wise, struck it down and said the Scottish Parliament had breached human rights in passing that law that would have allowed these confidential breaches. So hold the thought that powers that be can be wrong no matter how good their intentions are. So today I'm going to speak about the harm that's being done to children by the wholesale adoption of policies advocated for and actually written by small but influential lobby groups. In July last year, I wrote an article on the issue and I sent it off to the Herald because I just thought, right, enough. And nobody else seemed to be kind of doing it, and so I did, and I sent it off, and I was actually quite nervous because I'd seen the levels of abuse and criticism, and I thought, ooh, you know, but I'm fortunate in that I don't have an employer, and when I do work, I work for myself. Nevertheless, I knew I was kind of putting my reputation on the line and also putting any paid work possibly in jeopardy. But in fact, what I got, I was nervous and I thought, oh, maybe they'll come and break my windows or something. But in fact, I got lots of support, some from women who were relieved because they'd been watching in disbelief as things unfolded, and also from women who had not been aware, and other people, not all just women. So I've written more since, and I've also met, and we're beginning to meet a lot more face-to-face with lots of other women, and I think we've all gained strength and courage from these meetings, as we will from tonight, and you develop a sense of confidence in your beliefs, because when people first come to meetings, they're like, you know, am I really wrong, am I right, what's all this about? So what I wrote about, and what I'm going to talk about now, is the harm being done to children specifically. Now, I don't put the responsibility for this harm on the transgender activists who are kind of against us meeting tonight and so alarmed by us meeting. I totally agree with Rosa. They're young people, they're involved in activism, they're doing what they believe is right, and they are advocating for policies they believe in, and that is their right. That is free speech and that is democracy. And certainly I think, and I hope most everybody in this room would actually defend them if their rights to meet and talk and advocate what they want and what they believe in were being threatened. So that's where I'm coming from. But who I am angry with, or my criticisms, my criticisms are not against the lobbyists. What has appalled me and made me very angry on behalf of children and parents is the wholesale support that's been given to these beliefs and policies by the powers that be in Scotland at the highest level. So if you take the guidance, you can, on supporting transgender young people in schools, this was written entirely by 2 members of LGBT Youth and Trans Alliance Scotland. They wrote what they believed, they wrote their guidance. Both of these groups receive significant government funding, and they seem to have a presence at every policy table in Scotland, where we're certainly not at. Education Scotland, the NHS in Scotland, COSLA, the police, the prison service, human rights bodies, which sadly include the Children's Commissioner for Scotland, all welcomed or endorsed or promoted the guidance, all without asking what is the evidence base for this, all without any impact assessment. With Women and Girls in Scotland's great work in dissecting the guidance, we can see why good impact assessment, why they're an essential part of any policy process. The Children's Commissioner's Office should have completed that impact assessment and not left it to unfunded women's groups with no seats. If people wrote to say so. But asking for evidence and for what we found out is that asking for evidence and for impact assessments breaches the first commandment that we're all given, that there must be no debate about the basic tenets of transgender beliefs. Government and its agencies have been sadly only too happy to oblige. Some agencies threaten questioning staff with disciplinary action and even termination of their contracts. The demand that no one should dissent and no one should ask questions should have been a big red flag for government. Instead, it's acted as a gag. Harm has been caused and is being caused. I think that harm's been done on 2 levels, because I was trying to work this out when I was trying to work out what I was going to say. One is harm to all children by the teaching of stereotypical sexist views about what it means to be a boy or a girl. And this puts all children in a gender prison. It's particularly harmful for girls for obvious reasons. But it's also harmful to boys, and I'm sticking up for boys here as well. They get put in gender prisons. But the other harm that's created is to vulnerable children and young people who I believe are being pushed with this no debate down the rabbit hole of denial of biological actual sex, which I think will have and does have very unfortunate personal consequences for them. Possibly lifelong, possibly life-threatening. Sex and not gender is the material reality that we all have to deal with. No amount of changing names or birth certificates or bodies in any way will change a child's sex. But what are children as young as 4 or 5 being taught in schools? I mean, I'm not sure to what extent it's taught actively, but it's certainly, this is the orthodoxy that and what's going to happen is inclusive education plans for Scotland are to make what is called gender education compulsory. This is something that we can't even define. So they're being taught, children are being taught that they may have girls' brains and boys' bodies and vice versa. That if they don't feel like they fit with the pink-blue colour gender code, that it very likely means that their sex could have been assigned wrongly at birth. Some foolish doctor, no doubt. So here's a quote from a children's book that is actually recommended in the guidance and that is promoted, and the book's called Jazz. And the quote is, "From the time she was 2 years old, Jazz knew that she had a girl's brain in a boy's body. She loved pink and dressing up as a mermaid and didn't feel like herself in boys' clothing. This confused her family until they took her to a doctor who said that Jazz was transgender and that she was born that way. So that's, I think, an example of the harm at both levels. So that's addressed to all children, or it's a book that is being promoted to all children to try and explain it. But of course it will particularly impact on vulnerable children, because it's telling them things that aren't true, and that, anyway, I'll go on to that. So what I want to say is there are definitely boys who wish to be girls, and it seems more often as well that there are girls who wish to be boys. And yes, those children can be quite insistent on having boys' names and wearing only boys' clothes, or vice versa. And I want to remind you, I'm going back a long time, but tomboys feature strongly in children's literature and are particularly popular with girls. Girls love them. Yeah. I did. George in The Famous Five. What a role model, if you've not read it. And, George in The Famous Five, it is quite clear in the book, she always told people, I am a boy, and I wear boys' clothes, and I am a boy, and I will be treated like a boy. And she was insistent that she was a boy. So she, and I'm using this pronoun advisedly and correctly, was the most popular character in the books. I don't know if George grew up and lived as a man, but I very much doubt it. I suspect that she just lived as the kind of woman she was, the kind of woman a lot of us and didn't want to have babies, didn't want to be a bride, which I have to say I still think is pretty But I think she probably did live in trousers, as most of us do, and she was probably a feminist. And maybe she became an explorer or a scientist, or a law professor. But the evidence that we do have is that she would have gradually desisted, she would have accepted the physical reality of her body, and usually made a good adjustment to her actual sex as either a lesbian or a heterosexual woman. So some children don't desist, and I'm not denying their distress as adults if they continue to feel that they can't live in their actual sex. It seems to me, though, that we need a lot more research on whether and what treatments are helpful for this distress. Also, on the possible reasons for it, because we're being told it's all one thing, but are adult men who insist that they are women, despite not wishing to change their bodies, are they in the same category, are they the same cause as teenage girls who don't want periods and breasts, who would rather maybe stay in a kind of androgynous, pre-puberty, happy state, before the trouble all starts? So the guidance, however, and all this kind of teaching all starts from the single assumption that transgender individuals are born that way, somehow know that they have got some soul or essence in them that we all have, and that they should be supported, that tells them that they're not in, they're in the wrong body, and that they should be supported to transition to live in their gender identity, whatever that is, and not in their biological sex. Now, interestingly, the guidance defines children over 4, all children over 4, as young people. That's extraordinary. And it's interesting because that should also have been a bit of a red flag to the leaders of education services. And they should have been alert to it. Anything that defines a child as a young person. Children who might have it also advises that their parents, and this is another red flag, don't need to be told if a child of whatever age does not want them to know, which is actually legally incorrect, but it's also completely bad practice in working with parents and working with children in schools. We don't know how many schools have been following the guidance, but we do know that training has been given to thousands, literally thousands of teachers in Scotland, based on the guidance. And we know that an increasing number of children are identifying as transgender, and some of them are living double lives with their parents deliberately not informed. Somebody sent me yesterday a form that's been designed to tell teachers to inform them that this child is living in school as with a boy's name, and not to tell their parents when they come in, and to keep using the girls' names so the parents don't find out. And that's true, I know. So all of this without an evidence base, no impact assessment. Where is the research? And I think another worrying sign is that academics who disagree seem to be the particular focus of attack, personally and on their work. How am I doing for time?
No, you're fine.
So there's evidence that children who suffer from gender dysphoria suffer from other mental health problems. A high proportion of girls who are coming forward to say they're transgender are reported to be autistic. The connection between feeling different and not fitting in and being attracted to transgender beliefs is pretty obvious to anybody. It must seem to those children and to other people maybe as an easy diagnosis. Someone misidentified you at birth and can be easily fixed. You'll go to the doctor, you'll get a pill and you'll have surgery or whatever and everything will be fine. But encouraging children who are already distressed by feeling different and not fitting in to actually deny their material reality of their sex is not, surprisingly, I think, associated with a rising incidence of mental distress and self-harm. It's not a cure for it, it's actually a cause of mental distress in children. Parents are being terrified by the thought that their children might commit suicide, that they might be mentally ill, but actually their children are being set on a course of being made to have lifelong consequences, physical and mental. The holes in the case are obvious. Gender is a set of expectations which are based on sex, but it's become totally and deliberately confused with sex itself. So instead of being against stupid gender expectations, children are being asked to deny the reality of material reality. So I could say more about it. It seems to me it's a kind of Emperor's New Clothes tale for modern times, that everybody's just gone, accepted all this. So just briefly, The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir was published in 1949, and it certainly was a godsend for me. She dissected and demolished the othering of women, the denial of ownership of the meaning of our own lives. And then we had feminism and gay liberation were part of decades of progress and enlightenment after the Second World War, just as Rosa has set out. Feminism, like gay liberation, was not exactly welcomed by the establishment, but we got the Equal Pay Act, we got the Sex Discrimination Act, we got the right to control our bodies, contraception and abortion, we won the right to divorce, we exposed the hidden levels of physical and sexual abuse of women. Gay and lesbian struggles won the right to decriminalisation, to the same age of consent for sex, and just recently they won the right to partnership and marriage. So what feminists of my generation, and probably feminists of every generation, know with certainty is that all gendered expectations of girls and women and boys are just that. They're expectations that we have no intention of fulfilling. We know that children shouldn't be taught that there's innate characteristics and that they're not doing the right thing. There's nothing wrong with girls who want to play football or boys who want to cook. These are basic feminist beliefs. Most of these beliefs and values were well accepted into the 20th century and coming into the 21st, so we thought, and what a shock we have had. Gendered expectations are now being taught in schools and children informed that they may be in the wrong bodies. Pink and blue and Ken and Barbie are back. One of the ways that these views have become currency among people is on the basis that being transgender is the same as being gay. Being born in the wrong body like Jazz is just a normal occurrence in the population. Doctors will diagnose you, give you a pill, and wishes will be horses. However, being lesbian or gay, just like being heterosexual, doesn't require a denial of your biological sex, nor does it require any treatment. But transgender children face being set on a course of very specific treatment plans. Immediate transitioning without question, then puberty blockers, breast binders, hormones and surgery, all of them with harmful impacts on health or sexual function, on fertility, as Margaret McCartney and colleagues warned in the Lancet recently, and also psychological consequences. I think I probably have used up my time very well, and Rosa's probably covered some of the issues, but transitioning and gender, what's called transitioning is called a children's rights issue. Children have many rights, and they have rights to protection from harm, to education, to parental support. They don't have a right to what's called self-determination. They have a right to protection, and they can't be led to be giving informed consent to something that the adults talking to them. About the consequences. And we saw, sadly, some young people regretting massively the surgeries they'd had and saying, just kind of, well, they said do this, and then they said do that, and then you go and see them and they say, oh yeah, and then they tell you you're infertile, and then they tell you, you know, there's no such thing as informed consent in those circumstances. That because it's been confused and allied with gay and lesbian equality and children's rights, we're all supposed to say, how enlightened, how sensible, how very sensible about policies and practices that are harmful to children. Anybody could tell you, any parent, not any, but some, but you know, just ordinary people. But one day we're all going to have to answer the question, how could you let that happen? There will be inquiries, and there will be calls for inquiries, there will be angry and hurt people asking why this was allowed to happen to them. Why have these ideas been accepted by people in power and in leadership positions in children's services in Scotland? I don't know really. Only they can answer that. But I want to end by saying I have a feeling that many of them will be wondering how to cross back over the bridges that they've carelessly crossed. And I think we may need to help them to cross back over. We need to be heard as the voice of reason, asking for discussion, calling for evidence, asking to get around the table and talk about what's in the best interest of children. And I think our voice will only be strong enough to be heard if we meet and organise together like this. We must carry on meeting, must carry on talking and organising. Being face to face with a newly formed group of women in Edinburgh over recent months has been fantastic. I think we've all learned and we've all grown, and you just get more confident. The first thing people thought, if they came to a meeting, they'd be attacked, and we've met perfectly peacefully and had a really good discussions. And I know that there's groups in Glasgow, Dundee, Stirling and other places, and I hope we'll hear about that. So, I'm looking forward to a really good discussion about the future. What should our aims be? How should we share and learn from one another? And I want to thank you very much for listening to me, probably for too long tonight.